The Unholy, the story of her's journey to manhood, from tragedy to triumph. A tragic event, sometimes it can affect a family for generations. How the narrow mind of a religious community tries to maintain its traditions and survives in modern Brooklyn. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, Ultra-Orthodox Jews escaped from Eastern Europe to the New World. Her was an only child, born into a family stricken by history and steeped in ignorance and preconceptions. Her, reaching adolescence, decides to see the world outside, to leave the ghetto and break the eggshell in which he was raised. The Unholy, written by Gustav Bondy, narrated by Scott Neff. Chapter 1. Connecticut. They were living in a small town in Connecticut. 2 kids, both of them very intelligent children. The father worked in an insurance company. The mother's main worry was attending the kids, the family, and the house. The father was a strong, tall, fat man, his voice of seriousness and deep tone. It was a plain afternoon when the dad, Jersey, felt something in the air coming. He looked out the window. A Chevrolet stopped right in front of the suburban house. 3 men stepped out from the car. It was scary. They had never seen people like that before in their lives. It was a shock. There were 3 rabbis with white beards and white hairs, all dressed in black clothes. As soon as Jersey saw them, he said a curse in a strange dialect. The kids, the oldest being 12 years old, had never heard the curse word before. The mother was surprised. She didn't know how to react. Automatically, she went straight to open the door. But by that time, the rabbis were already pushing into the house. Jersey sat down at the dining room table, like waiting for some conversation that had been clearly postponed for years. Jersey didn't receive them so well. Very heated conversation and scenery was having the men 200% in their soul and their head. One of the rabbis moved and bounced his head while doing some kind of prayer, holding a small copy of a book. Another one was nervously crying on Jersey's face. The most powerful one knocked on the table while having a very heated manner towards Jersey. He was telling him and asking him what went wrong. Why are you living between all these Anglasis? He was demanding that he go back to his home in New York. Come back to our people. Stop dreaming of Israel, because their home was in the United States, he said. No time soon, they were going back to Hungary. He was shouting, telling him to stop his nonsense, to go back to his people, to let grow his pay, start reading back the Holy Scriptures, and to start calling the children by their Jewish names, Joel and David. Jersey tried to explain to them that he was working for the Mossad, and they were conducting serious investigations about immigrants after the Holocaust. He also let them know that this ghetto mentality was over. All have changed after the war. The intruding into his house was exposing him into this community as a Jewish spy, not as an insurance agent that he's been playing for all these years. The old man demanded he go back to his community. They knew that he could go back and sell his insurance, but he would not be getting that check from the Israeli government. When the rabbis left, they made it clear and shouted loud, "You are the Satmar. Stop your bullshit." They kissed their kid's hair and left. In Jersey's face, there was clearly an expression of deception. The years of being a spy were over. He would have to return to his sect and forget acceptance of Zionism. Chapter 2. Going to New York. It still took them a year or two to settle back in New York. Jersey was certainly not working for the Mossad anymore, and in the insurance business, he lost plenty of important clients. Strangely, they stopped buying local sausages from the Mueller family and started receiving packages of kosher sausages directly from the Big Apple. Joel, the older son, had a traumatic experience. He was 12 years old when they moved to Brooklyn. He attempted the local yeshiva. It was shocking, and he had to learn a weird new alphabet and dialects. For David, who was younger, it was easier. He still had a couple of years to adapt before attempting the yeshiva. He quickly picked up Hungarian, German, Yiddish, and Hebrew. Mother was a Holocaust survivor. She was familiarized with the culture and traditions of the Ultra-Orthodox Jews. Her family was from one of the small towns that the fanatic sects originated. Joel was an insecure, quiet teenager, traumatized by all of the change in his life, was traumatized by a strict father who, even before they moved to New York, was very harsh on the children, especially on Joel. He had a deception product of the ignorance. When Joel was born during labor, he broke his arm, so Jersey didn't have much faith in his child who was born handicapped. David, on the other hand, was confident. He was encouraged and motivated as a child. So the kids grew up and turned into young men. They were just like any other Hasidic Jewish family with dark curly hair. Since they were kids, they were motivated to be guided to their profession. David, when he was a little kid, was tutored by one of the old friends of his father into jewelry. Once a week, since he was a little boy, would go and help clean the gold and diamonds at their smelly jewelry shop on 47th Street. Joel got very interested in the scriptures. He was able to manage the readings like a master on the strict code of conduct that ruled his sect. On the other side, David was interested in the world, especially on all things that he saw in the city. He was astonished by cars, trucks, machinery, clothes, shoes, bicycles, candies, chocolates, magazines, pictures, and marquee. During their youth, they grew up under the flavor of sadness. They watched their unobserved mother transform from being the ideal 50s East Coast wife to a reformed, custom Jewish traditional lady. It was not enough to shave her head. She had to wear a wig, and on top of that wig a scarf. Her stockings covered all her legs, and they seemed to be very warm. Chapter 3. The Shiksa. And life in Brooklyn carried on. Everything stayed the same. The boys matured into men. Their destiny was to find a path to become respected men in their community, and to never forget the omnipresence of God. Traditionally, they gathered at the table for lunch and dinner and ate getife, matzo ball soups, and goulash. Jersey, who enjoyed eating, ultimately paid the ultimate price for his excessive eating. Everything happened around the dining table. They were a small family, but they had a lot of things going on. Jersey was a passionate man that did not relax when it pertained to matters involving his family. Then one day, David announced at the dining table that he was not going to work for his uncle's jewelry shop anymore, and had a better offer from some other folks who saw a better future for him. Jersey went crazy. He was leaving a job that his father had found for him. He was now going to work for the Ukraine Hasids. He shouted and slammed the table with his fist. He looked into the ceiling, closed his eyes, and started calling the prophet Alayu. Joe got a job working with his father, Jersey, at the insurance agency. When he was around 28 years old, his father decided to give him more responsibilities. Every year he had to collect money from their clients. Jersey would personally drive for the collection. Then one year, too tired to drive, he entrusted Joel to pick up collections from his clients. He used a pickup truck that his father did not own, but was always available for them to drive. It was a very difficult thing for Jersey to do. He was a one-man orchestra, trusting his son in his duties, was putting all the security of the family on Joel's shoulders. Joel did what his father told him to do. As a young boy, he followed his senses. While he was collecting in Crown Heights, he went to see a girl that worked in a vacuum repair shop over one of his father's clients. He naturally and instantly thought that he was in love. For an entire year, all he could do was think about her. He was just waiting for the collection season to begin so he could help his father again. He did a good job the previous year, so his father decided to send him again. This time in Crown Heights, he had it all planned up. He met the girl and had a long conversation with the owner of the store. He told the owner that the girl lived with her grandmother and had a difficult economic situation. On Hanukkah that same year, he pushed the girl inside the family without following any of their traditions. For Jersey and his mother, it was the end of the world. The gossip was beyond their control. The only way Jersey could react to all of this was at the dinner table. He called the prophet Elihu. Joel's mother, that was more cold and emotionless towards this girl that her son brought into the family because she was a yek, a German Jew too modern for their culture. She even called her a shiksa, like she was not Jewish. She also called her a kurva. When summer arrived, they got married. I won't detail the ceremonies, because they are just gossiping events. Jersey and the uncles were not very happy of this arrangement. Financially, they got nothing out of it, and believe me, from then on, whenever they saw Joel, they reminded him of all their critics and judgments. Chapter 4. Her. So they married, and they had a child named Her. Jersey and his wife were disappointed. Why would they name their son with such a progressive and unpopular name? They knew how he would be targeted in the future. They were folks who possessed a lot of knowledge, but their stupidity let them down. Jersey would complain on the table, moaning and calling the prophet Elihu. The marriage between Joel and his wife did not start very well, maybe because of Joel's new friend. He was a Jew from London who had a couple of properties and met Joel in the insurance business. Together, the two of them had quite an addiction to whorehouses and strip clubs. With a lump sum of money, they tried to fuck any woman who came in front of them. Truly, they were beasts. Maybe Joel's promiscuity started because of the gossip about Joel's wife flirting with other male members of the community. Maybe it was because of one incident during a celebration. She got tangled behind the curtains with the son of a prominent rabbi. The case was even discussed by the rabbis. It was not clear if they were engaging in sexual activity or if she was actually assaulted. After this event, it was chaos at home. Joel physically assaulted his wife in front of his family and in front of his baby Her. It was too much to take for a human being. She voluntarily left the kid behind with Jersey and his family, and no one knew where she went. She never returned to Brooklyn to see her son, or maybe she was never allowed to. All this wrecked old Jersey's nerves. He was fat, suffering from diabetes and heart disease because of his high cholesterol levels. Little Her remembered one winter night being woken up by some shouting in the living room. When he got to the living room, he saw the most bizarre scene. Jersey was on his knees shouting and crying like he was in some dark past memory. Maybe the one when the Gestapo shot his father in front of his family. For the rest of his years, Jersey listened to operas and felt useless. Joel seized control of the insurance client's book. In his career, he managed to investigate more than a dozen former Nazis through the insurance business. At 8 years old, Her witnessed his dear grandfather die. Chapter 5. Young Her. Young Her was now 16 years old. He attended all the schools and the yeshiva. He was not very good at studying, but was a very friendly and curious person. Once a week, all the students had to attend lectures taught by a rabbi in a synagogue downtown. The youngsters rode the community bus. Her, older, could ride the metro with his colleagues. Every week, they walked by a record shop. You could hear the rock and roll music blasting from the outside. One day he decided to stop by and have a look. He had it planned how he would skip school. After the lecture in the synagogue, he took a little longer in the bathroom, missed the walk back to the station with his friends, and quickly took his hat off, putting on a jockey, took his jacket off, and snuck into the store. All was new to him. The pictures amazed him. The sounds, the names of the artists, and the names of the tunes they played also amazed him. Other young boys like him, not Jewish, were enjoying themselves. He grabbed a small flyer of local concerts and put it in his shirt pocket. He left the store very quickly after realizing that he spent an hour inside. He arrived home late. His grandmother had already been on the phone with his friends. She found the demonic flyer in his shirt, showed it to her son Joel, who got furious and slapped his boy just like he did his wife. David was never home, and he could care less. He was always high, locked up in a little room full of diamonds. Herr started showing interest in photography. He would visit the B&H in Manhattan that was run by the Hasids, and worked as an intern. One of the store managers saw the boy's interest and kindly lent him an old camera that was repaired but never picked up, with 2 rolls of black and white 35mm film. During the little time he had off, he would take beautiful pictures, but this angered his father, who got infuriated and slapped him. He did not perform well in the yeshiva. Photography was a waste of time to his father, who continuously slapped the boy and left him crying. His father was so abusive that he ripped the pictures into pieces and with evilness put them in Herr's mouth. Young Herr was empty inside. He never knew the true story about his mother, felt something missing in him, didn't even dare to understand or ask what was going on or what went wrong in the past. Herr was not a boneless coward like Joel and David. Even though he was prohibited, he would find a way to stop by the record store. He already knew a couple of friendly faces. Some youngsters like him, curious of his appearance and politeness, invited him to have a little smoke in the alley. But on the way back, his grandfather smelled the mix of cigarettes and weed and told Joel, who slapped him once again. Joel would flip if he knew that when David took young Herr to help clean the diamond, he would give the boy weed to make work more fun. David would sniff cocaine and drink the dirty whiskey and obviously talk his head off. Herr possessed wisdom because he grew up alone. He felt a deception from the cold environment around him, being more a part of a machine instead of an individual. Seeing that his grandmother couldn't do much for him, his father ended up being a reflection of all of his frustrations. Many times his father told him that he was his worst mistake in life. To David, Herr was just a factor of manipulation. He was always trying to make Herr look stupid among others. Always trying to put Herr aside, afraid of losing part of his heritage privileges. He did not want to share with no one. Herr decided enough was enough and sought freedom, like people in the songs that he had heard in the record store. He was viewed as a bastard, did not have friends, and was treated differently by people. One day at the table, he told his father that he was leaving. They laughed at him. You wouldn't dare. Herr had purchased some jeans at the Salvation Army, received an old Anthrax t-shirt from a friend at the record store, and traded Converse sneakers for something he took from David without his consent. At nighttime he left. He promised himself not to follow traditions anymore, to never ever speak in his cultural languages again, and to never ever return home. Chapter 6. Blind Priest. So the first thing that he did was search for his mother. Years earlier, he found a letter on the mailbox from her. She said that she loved him and was waiting for him to grow up and come visit her. Because of fear, he had to hide the letter for years without anyone in his family discovering it. When he arrived at the address, the sun was rising. He walked up the steps and to the doorway that was opened. He entered in an old house with a wooden floor, walked his way to a back room where he saw some light. Lying in the bed, an old skinny and dry lady was giving her last breath. She instantly recognized her. She welcomed and explained to him that his mother had been waiting for this moment for years, but unfortunately had died. She pointed to old furniture where Herr found a pack with about 12 envelopes of letters that had been returned. They were from his mother. In the letters she wrote and expressed how much love she had for her, and that she was just waiting for him to one day come and visit her. She explained the unfortunate destiny, but not giving more information to the young boy, and was in peace, with no one to blame for the sad circumstances that occurred. About to die emotionally, Herr made a prayer for the dead that he had memorized. He closed his eyes and experienced a turning point in his life. He felt a hand on his shoulder. When he turned around, he saw an old priest, blind, on his chest a cross, and in his hand another one hanging from a silver chain. Her easily recognized the silver. His grandmother told her that she really didn't have much to give him but her blessing. Her old friend, the priest, would guide her grandson in the future into the knowledge and wisdom, protect him from evilness. This would turn out to be a milestone in the young man's life. She knew that the priest had guided many others before, and tutoring her grandson her would be a blessing. Peacefully, the grandmother passed away, and the boy started a new life as a helper for the blind priest. They got inside a church where the priest lived. The blind priest decided to give her his first lesson. He told him to put his ear close to the statue of St. Peter, where he would hear his own fortune. When the young man placed his head near the statue, the priest slapped him and had his head slammed into the statue. The blind man told him, "If you're going to help a priest, you have to be 1 point smarter than the devil," he laughed. Another time he recorded in memory was when the priest each night drank wine from a jar until he passed out. Her would make a straw to drink the wine without the blind man noticing, but unfortunately, when he did notice, he slapped him, just like his father Joel used to. Her starved to death with that priest. He barely ate. He had to hear all his stupidity and lectures on how he tricked this world and the stupid souls that live in it. One day, he got lucky when a police squad came and picked up the old priest, who had to appear in court for some crimes he committed inside that very church. Her thought at the end that grandmother was right. He acquired a lot of knowledge from the priest. He was no longer naive, nor stupid. He broke the eggshell that his culture and traditions had kept him locked up in. Chapter 7. Freedom. He was scared. He had to run away and was not going back home. He snuck into a couple of trains with no money. He did that for a couple of days, till he found a way to settle in Baltimore, where he got a job scraping boats. He did well there. What he had learned from the priest was being applied. He didn't trust anyone, just like the blind man taught him, and he was constantly 1 step smarter than the devil. Work smart, not hard. He developed a more refined taste for wine and beers, but he was empty, just like he was in New York. He felt his soul was empty. He managed to save money and decided to start walking on the trails. Summer was starting, and everybody enjoyed the beautiful landscapes and sceneries of the great Appalachians. Camping was fun. He made friends with people from all over that visited the United States, including kids from Israel who were taking the year off after serving in the military. Manly white Western barbarians with their pet friends were hard for her to communicate with. They were scared, hiding something, didn't know where the fuck he was from. Her ran out of money that winter, so he stayed in a town in West Virginia called Little Orleans. Once spring arrived, he left for the trails again. He followed a river. One day he found an older guy on a raft that made his living crossing people from one side to the other. He was a ferryman. He had long hair and a very calm look in his face. Her offered him a pair of Converse that he had kept in his backpack, and in exchange he asked to be hired as a helper. He wanted to learn. Vasudeva was his name, and he was a very quiet person. He smiled with tender eyes, accepting silently the offer of his new disciple. Who was this Vasudeva? Was he a ghost? Was this man her himself? Was he meeting his future self, or the man that he was going to turn into? He was very confused. Vasudeva, very quiet, was a very wise and clever man. First of all, he was very handy. He could build rafts and tents, articles for the day-to-day, and he had been there for a long time. Again, he was a very quiet man. He always listened. Her felt good, felt confident, and talked a lot, all the time externalizing his experiences. Vasudeva was always listening with an open heart. He would instruct the young man to talk to the river, to find the inner genetical wisdom that, according to him, we all carry. He would also explain to him that there was no time, no need to be impatient or rush. Time didn't really exist. He would place the river as an example. Look at the river, no start, no end, always there. Don't be in the frequency of the short term. Have a cathedral way of thinking. For Vasudeva, there was no goal to seek. The goal was going to come to you. For Vasudeva, there was no wisdom to be found, but only partial knowledge. For Vasudeva, seeking too much wisdom was dangerous. What is valuable wisdom for a human being will always sound like foolishness to another. You cannot love words, but you can truly love things. You cannot love ideas, but you can love facts. You cannot love the teaching, but you surely can love the river, learn from the river, and talk to the river. Don't ever be afraid of anyone. The only one to fear is your own self. Don't ever leave doors open behind you. Close every door and never open them back. Vasudeva was totally different than a traditional guru, as we would say. Instead of teaching and preaching, he normally stayed quiet. Instead, practicing prayers or meditation. He always smoked weed. He would smoke like Shiva in the mountains, almost turning bluish. Chapter 8. Wicked. One day, Vasudeva asked her to help him out with a rock. This stone was big enough for both men to lift. With very little effort needed, they removed it from its spot and placed it on the side. Vasudeva dug a hole with the help of her. After they removed the soil, they removed layers of trash bags, under those a motorcycle. Her was amazed. It took them a couple of days to clean it. While they hid it behind some bushes, Vasudeva proudly called that motorcycle the Widowmaker. Her did not feel empty anymore. Now he had a feeling of closure and shut some open doors. Another day he helped him dig out a big can of gasoline. That day Vasudeva addressed her and asked him if he was planning to stay in the river forever. Her replied that he was thinking about moving forward. He needed to close those doors. They needed to be slammed shut. It was a sunny spring morning when Her was woken up by Vasudeva. The motorcycle was ready for him. He went over for a couple of instructions while the bike was roaring. Don't squeeze it all the way. Hear the engine beat. He showed him a map. He had traced the roads that were less likely to give him problems on his trip to Cali. Days before, he had trained his young friend on how to change gears, brake, turn the bike, and to start the engine. Before Her squeezed the throttle and vanished in the horizon, they gave each other a long hug, and Vasudeva told him, as far as it takes you, you have to be grateful. Just remember, it ain't no kidding. This fucking bike is called the Widowmaker. Her disappeared, leaving dust behind him. Closing those doors, only now he was going the opposite direction. He traveled all day, filling the tank of the motorcycle out of the can of gasoline that his old friend secured in an improvised rack at the back of the motorcycle, tied with old inner tubes. That night it was so dark, he had no headlights, missed a curve, and received a minor injury to his leg. So he decided to sleep that night, cuddling with the Widowmaker in the same position that the fall left him. The next morning, the wound wasn't as bad as it could have ended up being. So this time he felt more confident and tried to make Widowmaker go a little faster. Nothing good lasts forever. It really doesn't matter if it runs out of gas or if the Widowmaker needed a minor repair. He spent the next 28 hours sitting next to a big rock in the middle of nowhere. 1 or 2 cars passed by during the time. 4 or 5 trucks drove by. Her was not even worried about asking for help. An old, run-down, rusty F-100 pickup truck drove by Her. Inside, an old hairy guy wearing a leather jacket with no sleeves, full of spikes and some tight leather pants, just being nosy. In the afternoon, the same old man in the same truck came by and asked Her if he needed a ride. The young man accepted. They loaded the bike on the pickup truck and left for the next safe spot. He drove to a small yard, or maybe a hoarder's mansion. Outside the entrance, leaning on some junk, smoking a cigarette, there was a 6-foot 2-inch woman wearing a small football helmet, greased t-shirt, and dirty blue jeans. She looked like a man. Next to her, leaning on a police vehicle with an unidentified county location, was a Hispanic police officer with a big black mustache looking at her without confidence. The old man, dressed in leather, jumped out of the pickup truck, received a couple of dollars from the strange woman. She had already unloaded the motorcycle from the pickup truck. She was strong. The big woman, that had a couple of blonde hairs coming out of her chin, offered him cigarettes. She asked him the typical questions: where are you from? Where are you going? How much you want for that bike? Her was surprised. He was not expecting to sell the Widowmaker. If he could get a couple of dollars to continue his trip, he would be grateful, just like Vasudeva said. You know this is the Widowmaker, Her told the big woman. They laughed their guts out. Her did not understand. Then the big woman told her to come to her office for them to finish closing on the bike. At the back of the property, there was a building made out of old buses. Inside the office, it was dark. One side of the walls was only porn. The rest of the place looked like a torture chamber full of weird equipment. In the room, you could only hear the sound of water leaks. She sat down at the desk. Suddenly, the Hispanic police officer rampaged at her, placing his gun at his head, asking with rage, "Where did you steal this bike? Who does it belong to? Stop that shit!" The big woman shouted. She stood up, slapped the hell out of the Hispanic police officer, and punished him for his lack of respect towards a decent man with a decent trade. She apologized to her and shouted at the police officer, ordering him to go put his special gear. She counted dollars on top of the desk and asked her if he was willing to take the money or maybe get paid in another way going, pointing to the police officer, who came from behind the door, totally naked with leather straps and handcuffs. Her said, "No way." The big lady asked him to accept one more offer. Maybe he was willing to be paid with what was behind the curtain. When she opened the curtain, there was a big cow tied up to a bed with ropes swinging at its head. Her grabbed the money from the desk and ran away from that place and towards light he saw in the distance from a town about 3 miles away. After wandering down south, broke, he found a temporary job cutting oranges for a Hispanic farmer. The man drove a pickup truck with about 10 or 15 workers in the back. He did not pay much, but Her didn't care. He just wanted to save money for his ticket like he had done previously. He didn't worry about hunger. The blind man trained him well on the secrets of starvation. It was a boring job in the sun all day, waiting for the man to pick them up in the pickup truck. He would take them to a barn where they slept and made their food. Every night they would have little parties, so usually they were hungover the next morning for work. They barely slept, heard the radio playing all night with rancheras, cumbias, and corridos. That morning, they were collecting oranges from a tree field when suddenly some huge pickups and a truck stormed them. Her was not very lucky, maybe cursed by life, maybe cursed by his family, maybe cursed by his own people, the Satmar, maybe cursed by his mother and grandmother. He felt cursed mostly by Joel and David. Of most sadness, he was convinced God was cursing him. A handful of good people, how referred to themselves, appeared in the scene and were not very friendly. Came out pointing guns, assault rifles, and shotguns. The leader was an Anglo-Saxon man, around 40 years old, blonde eyebrows, and facial hair. He was holding a Winchester in his left hand, resting the barrel on his shoulder. Before he started talking, he gave a spit to the ground. "I know you all come to work out here, but we don't want you to bring your problems with you, so you all can go back to work in your damn countries. We decent people out here, we don't want you near our wives or children. Our government decided to build a wall, and while the wall is being built, we, the good people, have decided to help our government. We're not coming here to chase you. We don't want to do you harm. We're just going to show you your way out. We don't want to see you around here again. You are going to be sorry if you come back. Now that you're going back to your places, once you get there, Tell your amigos it ain't easy around here no more, goddammit. You come over here riding on our roads, eating our McDonald's, Burger Kings, and fried chicken joints. Then you think that you all can come out here and take women. Well, like I said again, we're going to make sure now your asses don't come back here no more. One of the Karens that was sitting down in one of the pickup trucks interrupted the man and told him, I don't think they understand what you say. She was right. They did not understand nothing but her. He was not going to answer back. Who was going to believe he was not a beaner or a wetback? Everybody was nervous and worried. They made us sit down on the floor and were surrounded. The Hispanic farmer, more like a human trafficker, was sweating the shit out of his body. Those people had all their eyes on top of him. They knew that he was running that operation. He couldn't deny it. It looked too obvious. The Hispanic farmer, like a beast, trapped in the corner, was ready to give his last fight. He stood up and confronted those good people and said, Mi cajo en estos pinche pendejos, mi vel madre. Vien a manchar todo. Mamen la verga hijos. De puta me valen madre. He reached down to pull out a gun that he had in his pocket, pointed it to the leader, and triggered it. No bullet came out of the weapon, so he used it like a stone and started to run away in between orange trees. The leader pointed his shotgun and shot. The shotgun blasted back in his shoulder, only aiming a few pellets on the farmer's skin, and said in pain, This shit kicks like a mule. Get that motherfucker. Another, of the good people, stood up with an AK assault rifle, and with 2 single shots ripped the back of the farmer, splashing blood into the oranges that were ready to be collected. They forced the people into a truck that had already some others and drove them to a river, ordered them to cross, and as they did, they celebrated with shots directly into the water and into the air, just like Western barbarians, Sheldons and Karens in the lumberjack shirts and Daisy Dukes. Chapter 9. Pigs. This book was written in the harshest conditions that an American citizen could have experienced since World War II. It was written while I was homeless during the winter of 2020 in Washington, D.C., facing the coronavirus and the uprisings in the Capitol Hill. I hope I have not bothered you with too many words. I will now continue the story without fancy details, so you can continue to be part of the creation through your imagination. Apart from that, I've been here for 4 years paying for medical bills because of a doctor's mistake, without being able to buy breakfast from McDonald's for myself. Her, gratefully, despite every single trace of heritage that run through his veins, he did not belong to anyone as far as he remembered. He was born by himself and dumped like trash when he was a baby child. He understood that he was cast away by society. He understood that people like him could never have healthy relationships in this world. They were to live alone, targeted and abused. He also understood that the main problems of the world were mainly related to women's sexual problems, insecurities, anger, and handicaps that are transmitted to children and individuals in society. The problems of the world are just reflections of sexual problems of women. Her had good luck this time. He traveled long distances in trucks, immersing himself deep in South America. He had no profession, no job, mostly just traveled and found tricks to survive. He was now not only deep in the land, he was deep in the culture. He did not speak the languages fluently, but for him was able to communicate. Even though he was not very talkative, he already talked enough with Vasudeva. He had a very particular taste for wine, which was a religious thing to have. He and some colleagues used to buy big jugs with 5 liters of the cheapest white wine. After drinking a third or more, they would pee in the jug to refill the content and change it for a new one or get their money back. Like Vasudeva, he had a particular taste for weed. Because of his long hair, People usually asked him if he knew where to find some marijuana. That was the opportunity he waited for. He would ask them to wait in a restaurant or bar while he went to find some weed. When he returned, he gave them a bag or some kind of wrap and told them to check inside the bathroom so as not to attract any attention. After giving him the money, they would go to the bathroom, check in the bag, and find nothing more than dirt. By then, her would be long gone. Because of these stupid tricks, he left one flank open. After performing one of his tricks, he and his fellow friends went to the beach to enjoy the moonlight, the sound of the waves, and some wine. After a while of them sharing, without any notice, they saw some flashlights approaching them. It was the police. They slapped them around, made them form a line, and had them run to a station about 2 kilometers from the beach. The station was an old farmhouse from the 1700s with colonial-style red adobe walls and grass growing out of the mud collected from the roof. They used half of the house. The other half was damaged by earthquakes over the years. The policemen were short, fat, and mean. The uniforms were old. You could tell that they had been inherited several generations. They reprimanded them to the booking room. They looked at her and his friends. There were no questions to be asked. They were just kids drinking some wine on the beach. They locked them up overnight, released them the next morning. In the back of the farmhouse, there were some stables. They looked more run down than the house. They squeezed her and a dozen more of his friends in one of the stables. It was supposed to hold only one horse. There was no way they could all sit down. They stood up. It was still early in the night. You could hear the policemen watching soap operas and the 8 o'clock news on a black and white TV. The kids were young, and it didn't take long before boredom kicked in. All they could do was talk crap to each other, argue, and laugh, and they had no access to a bathroom. Her was a very active man. This was the first time he was held to some kind of punishment. Maybe he experienced something like that in the yeshiva, but he was very impatient. There was a small window on the stable door. He was able to put his hand and rest his arm out. Since he was tall and skinny, his long fingers were able to unlock an old wooden lock on the improvised cell. He opened it. His friends, panicked and scared, asked him to close it and come back in. Her told them that he was just going to take a whiz. He stood out next to the stable and started peeing, looking at the house where he could see the light of the TV and the shades of the policemen's heads through a window. Her looked to the air, zipped up his blue jeans, and looked at the cell. When he looked inside the cell, he could see his friends. He could see just their eyes looking like pigs, ready to be slaughtered. Her laughed, quietly locked the cell from the outside, and walked away. Chapter 10. Let's say he was still wandering through the deep lands of the New World. He had demons, people from his past that chased him in the present, and though not present in the real form, they appeared to him like ghosts in dreams. During his journeys, he learned many things and taught many things to kids. He loved to perform a ceremony on the nature where he would invite friends and people to bring food and drinks for a day on the open, what usually in the Western world is called a picnic. He liked sharing this ceremony that he learned maybe while he was around Peru or Bolivia. The Pachamama is Mother Nature, and before the arrival of the conquistadors, the native cultures had a ritual for thousands of years called Pego a la Tierra. He would make a hole in the land, where along the day they would give bits of offers from the food and drinks they had, sharing with Mother Earth and paying back, since she is the provider and continues to provide for our children and their children. Her was a very singular individual. He had the ability to attract interesting and confident crowds. Maybe that was a hidden superpower that he had. He did not like to explore it. Was he maybe afraid? During the Purim festivities, he was always performing in the yeshiva. In any crowd activity, he was relaxed. Something strange and shady was going through his mind. Maybe he found himself in a dead end, or didn't know how to ease out a tortured mind. Well, let's say better that he had a dream. It was the 1950s, and Her had been invited to a dinner party in some fancy neighborhood of Mexico City. The event was on a stone mansion with beautiful trees and a gorgeous illuminated garden. The driveway had a couple of Parker Chevys and Fords. The servants were all dressed in black ties and fluffy dresses, holding silver trays and always looking down. On the first floor of the mansion was a distribution of dining rooms, a huge kitchen, and rooms that were connected, created, and decorated with velvet curtains and objects from all over the world. Fancy people gathered for that occasion. They all wore the shiniest jewelry and glamorous clothes. But the reason that they gathered there was not because of any superficiality. The reason they were there was very profound and had a deep meaning. They were gathered in that mansion in Mexico City to act judgment to no more and no other than God. God was put onto trial by a group of people during the 1950s in Mexico City. They were blaming God for not doing his job. Instead of happiness, that's what gods are for. He was only bringing pain to humanity and sorrow. A man in a long jacket with gray hair and a big forehead knocked with a stick on the floor, and everybody, in a sort of choreography, got organized in different places, like on a real court. So the trial began. There was a defender and a prosecutor. There was a scribe and a judge. With the exception of the witnesses, the rest of the people in the court were compromised of the jury. They brought out the first witness, who exposed the horrible conditions of Afro-descendant people and Native Americans, including all the suffering they experienced from the beginning of colonization of the New World. The people were served nice cocktails and finger snacks, drinking the finest whiskeys and wines. The second witness was a Jew that exposed how his people suffered during the Exodus, the pogroms, and the Holocaust. All this while people listened respectfully while being served the best liquors, drinks, and food that any human being could appreciate in that time. The final witness exposed one particular case that happened on Route 66 in the state of Arizona. The Dolphus family had 4 children that were no older than 12 years old. They decided to camp next to the road one summer night. The kids stayed in the tent next to the car, and the parents slept inside the car. In the morning, the youngest woke up, got out of the tent, and went to wake up his parents. Both parents were covered in blood after being slain by a brutal murderer. The killer's mind was so distorted, he left the children alive for them to see the horrific scenery. He stole $60 from the father's wallet. How could someone do this? A man that supposedly had been created by God could perform such a savage and terrible crime. What kind of world did God make for us? Those kids did not deserve that at all. He left many questions opened. The people continued eating and drinking. Now it was time for the defender to be exposed. By that time, there was so much to eat and drink, the defender was already drunk. He could not even speak, so there was no one to defend God in this trial set by humans. It was late at night, and everybody was wasted. So in quick deliberation of the trial, the judge gave the jury only a couple of minutes to decide. Their decision: God was guilty. Guilty for giving up on men. Guilty for doing a crappy job regarding humanity. One other time, Her was in the region of Salta, north of Argentina, a little cattle village in the middle of nowhere, dry and dusty, people with thick black hair, brown skin, and tiny eyes that were very friendly. Her didn't feel comfortable, not because of the emptiness inside him, more for the stress and torture of the open doors that he had in his head. Unfortunately, a child died in a very poor home. The following nights for a couple of weeks, the town experienced some strange paranormal activity and ghostly events. They were not real, but hypothetically real for those who were facing the trauma, on top of all the others that society had cursed them with. They didn't know what to do. The Christian preachers and pastors were useless. They were good at collecting money and mediating in business within their communities. just like those old dirty Hasidic rabbis from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, or 47th Street. He decided to perform an old magic trick that he read passionately in the old writings and was most occulted. Her came out with an explanation that he could not share with the rest of the people, most of their lack of understanding and narrow culture. He was convinced that the demon wrapped up in a snake that is described in several ancient books had taken the child and was still wandering in the village, ready to take another innocent soul. I don't want to name the demon, in order not to curse your reading or my writing, but I will let you know that it is a female demon that Jewish people are mostly scared of. He had read in the ancient books about the incantation bowls you could trap demons and get rid of them. So he, with mud, handcrafted a bowl that he dried in the sun. He decorated the bowl with writings from edge to the center and some poems in the Hebrew alphabet that he had kept in a remote corner of his memory. Without telling anybody, one night he made a hole in a special place of the village. He buried the bowl upside down, covered the hole carefully so nobody would find it. That same night, he left the village, hoping that the bowl would catch the demon and free those souls from more unrested night. Her continued his journey south. Chapter 11. Dinner Stories. Her didn't care about the rest of the world, didn't care even about his future, didn't care about really closing the doors that he had left behind him. He just did not care. He did not believe in love, and he did not trust people. He lived like everybody, out of memories, over that dinner table with his family around it, and particularly on the stories that Jerzy used to tell. Jerzy would talk about Hungary, about his grandfather Ilz, who was a rabbi and a winemaker in the south of Hungary, about his uncle Zoltan, who was the head Ravi on the town of Kipest. Jerzy remembered how his grandfather, his grandmother Paulina, Uncle Zoltan, and his wife Olga, with their kids Eva, Sari, Zuzi, and Andras, died in Auschwitz. How his mother Frederica and his aunt Cernini spent all the time hiding in a bunker eating beans. Once they made it to New York after the war, they did not last long, only several months. Cernini got lost, froze to death on a cold winter night, and Frederica was found dead one morning. His family was still recovering from the traumatic death of an 8-year-old cousin, Imre, who died of food poisoning, and his mother Elinksa had a heart attack and also died during the late 30s. But the far most fascinating story Jerzy shared with his family was about those 15 years that he spent working for the Mossad. He was recruited mainly because of his youth, size, and scholastic degrees. He was hired by an insurance company so he could obtain information from people that was most likely not to be found. He explained that his code name was Jerzy, and how most of the intelligence information was delivered on telegrams and newspaper ads with code wording. On his pickup career on the Mossad, he was assigned to an extra important mission. Israeli government had been flagged by former Hitler-Jugend leader Fritz Barbie, who had been recruited by the American intelligence for operations on the East Coast. Barbie was a special target for the Mossad. He did not commit crimes during World War II, but his background as a leader was a big concern for the Israelis, who didn't want him to spread Nazi propaganda in the United States. The seek for Barbie was easy. Inside the American intelligence, an agent of the Mossad had already identified Fritz's new name, birthplace, and date of birth in the United States. It only took Jerzy a couple of weeks to find life insurance under this new name and an address in upstate New York. So Barbie was found at that address, north of New York State, near the border of Canada. He lived with a wife and a small child, almost 3 years old. Now Jerzy was only waiting on some strategy to get rid of this guy without anybody noticing. A circus came into town at the same time Jerzy was conducting his operation. He got backup from a gangster from New York that had been assigned by a capo in some kind of exchange program the Mafia had with the Mossad. Jerzy was clever enough to send an invitation card to Barbie and his family from the circus that was visiting the small town. Inside the envelope were 3 tickets that Jersey had purchased. Barbie, maybe, was too confident of the United States intelligence protection. On the date of the invitation, he was there sharp on time, wearing a white scarf and a white hat, happy and joined by his wife and child. No later than 5 minutes that the show started, Jersey recruited a young lad and paid him with a pack of cigarettes. He told the young boy to tell Barbie to check on his car outside. Fritz Barbie, full of confidence because of United States intelligence protection, walked outside to the parking spot where his car was, and as he approached his car, Jersey called him by his name. Fritz Barbie, Sie ist gekommen. Time has come today. With a piece of strong cable he had tied to 2 chops of wood, he pushed Fritz behind the car and strangled him to death. Barbie tried to free himself, but slowly his legs began moving slower and slower, showing he couldn't keep up the fight. Quickly, they got the keys out of the car, put him in the back seat, and drove to a lake south. There, they dumped the car and took another ride that was waiting for them to drive straight to Connecticut. Her's grandmother, on the other side, had her own stories. Her great-grandfather, Alexander Goldman, was a cattle dealer on the Rice and Hesse region. He had 3 sons, Moises, Solomon, and Simon. They were born around the 1810s, and all 3 male children had migrated to the United States before the unification of Germany from Alsace, among 250,000 other German-speaking Jews. All 3 uncles died in San Francisco around the 1920s. The girls stayed in Germany and eventually got married and lived in big cities. Out of 9 uncles on her mother's side, and around 7 from her father's side, Her's grandmother could not trace any uncles or cousins after the war. Her's grandmother was a trip. She would tell him that where he stepped, not even bad weed would grow after. She told him that when he was born, the Bubbas were gossiping that his skin was dark. She had a pathological relationship with her phone. She would call other Bubbas 2 or 3 times a day and talk gossip. She would wrap everything in foil paper. She would often argue with Jersey because of her aluminum foil swans, which she used to decorate the dining table. She never had anything positive to say about nobody, and the racial hate was always alive. Joel was another Freudian case. He was still traumatized from the time he left Connecticut when he was 12 years old. He was not strong enough to take this drastic change. Remember that he had left the Catholic school to go straight to the yeshiva and was 3 times demanded more than any other kids. The shock from being told overnight that he was a Jewish Hasid and adopting the minhag had clearly rattled his mind. He developed a fucked up personality, a personality of negation, personality of anger, of prejudice, of superficiality, and a lack of tender relationships between human beings. He had a fear of being ethnically less. Joel had a friend in London that had a couple of properties in the U.S. that were insured by him. They would escape to Paris, where they had everything going on. Frequently, they would stay in a chateau on the outside of Bordeaux that was a famous whorehouse with a huge selection of girls. They would save their guts all year to later spend thousands of dollars in this savage, bestial sexual rampage washed by champagne. The family always discovered Jersey's late with his wife. She would read every letter that arrived home, especially the credit card statements. David was another case of the same species of boneless cowards. He had been working in the 47th Street Diamond District all his life, selling love diamonds and protected by black men with Uzis. They would have so much crooked business going on in there. They melted gold for the Colombian narcs, laundered money for politicians with jewelry. He even knew a network of Puerto Ricans that picked pockets and bought jewelry from them. He used her when he was a child as a cover for his crooked businesses. Sometimes he would pretend to take the child to the zoo on the weekends, when really they were running from pawn shop to pawn shop in the weirdest neighborhoods. David tried to manipulate anybody. He had a very Machiavellic mind, and maybe because he was a short man, he was full of insecurities, and he had a lot of anger, just like Napoleon. In their narrow minds and little world, they lived inside an intellectual and emotional eggshell. David and Joel were tied to competition for the acceptance or the heritage of Jersey. Jersey's wife was the one who mediated in the middle of all this strange and tiring circus plots. When Jersey often asked David why he had not married, he would put the dead dog eyes look at his mother. She would claim that there was no good woman for her son. A big shouting argument would start around the dining table. Her would remember his friend Vasudeva, and what a character he was. He lived secluded from the world, without anything, in a tent, not even receiving a proper paycheck. A man like that, so clever, so calm, so peaceful. Like he renounced from the world. Maybe something bad happened to him. Maybe he lost his wife and family in an accident. Maybe grateful to have survived and live in peace. Her stayed a long time next to Vasudeva, learned about nature and craft techniques for the wilderness. Those were sweet memories for him, and they shared the love for the triple W, weed, wine, and women. Her tried desperately to make connections between the widowmaker and his friend. Everything was so fast. That deal had no time for questions, and widowmaker remained one of those mysteries every man wants to solve. Where did that motorcycle come from? Was it owned by Vasudeva, and he buried it to forget? Was his plan to go to Cali? But he gave up and saw in her his younger self, and somebody that could finish that plan, or better, I say, that trip. Maybe his friend was just an outlaw, hiding from justice, hiding the evidence like dogs. Maybe his friend had other things buried in that site. He also had the hypothesis that maybe some other folk left the bike there and Vasudeva decided to hide it. Maybe he crossed and he was supposed to come back and never did. Many things could happen, and many things her imagined. This is a little portion of the memories that he lived out with on his journey. Chapter 12. Her had no belongings. He usually smoked in a brown paper or in pages ripped off of the Bible. If he had the chance to sleep on a mattress, it was an inflatable one. In the places he rented, and he just used camping chairs and discarded silverware and plates. He was only worried about keeping his clothes clean and his hair healthy. He loved to listen to radio, rock and roll tunes from AC/DC, Ride On, the Ramones' Needles and Pins, Motorhead, Saxon, Judas Priest, Running Wild, and many more. When they asked him if he believed in God, his answer was no, God believes in me. Many years went by, and many roads Her traveled. Many people he met, many places he stayed. And one day, talking to a lady that he had met before, after gaining confidence, taking a bath in the river. She looked at him with a special glance. She touched his leg with two of her fingers, and he answered, kissing one of her brown nipples. Her was getting married. So everything that happens with married couples happened. Her quickly understood. When you marry not only the person, but its community. Communities can be divided for social class, for ethnicities, for even a soccer team. If you don't belong to the same community, things are harder. You aren't bowed to your beliefs, to your culture, to your nature. Damned as long as you stay in the earth. But again, I need to tell you all, he needed to close those doors, so he settled for a couple of years and got a job as a librarian at the Goth Institute, where the job was easy for him. Here he had time to read and maybe to go deeper in his own self. He decided to close those doors slammed shut. Her saved some money, and it took him a while to get his United States immigration documentation back. He had gone years without any identification, crossing countries through unwatched borders, just like backpackers do in those lands. During this time, he had a dream that would repeat periodically. It was the scene from one of the scriptures. Her dreamed of Noah's Ark. He was watching Noah while he was holding a big rope pushing up some kind of beast. That beast was tied by the neck on the other extreme of that rope. It was the Ryam. The Ryam is a mythological creature that looks like a giant unicorn. You could only see his nostrils fighting to breathe out of the water. Noah was holding him to save him from the water since there was no way that giant animal could go to the top of the ark. The Rayam was fighting for his life not to drown. The water and air created a mist in the storm that was ripped by the harsh rain. So he decided to leave. It was an open door that he could come back and shut later. He was in the mid of his life. Chapter 13. Unholy. He arrived at the bleeding jaws of capitalism after years and years. He realized nothing had changed. All was the same. On a small ride on the subway from JFK to Brooklyn, he saw the same shit in which he grew up. It was the same dirty city with the rats and the homeless people, fucked up on crack, boat and K2, Pilgrim Inn on trash cans. Fuck. Fuck the Pakistani, Ethiopian, whatever. Submissive motherfuckers carrying delivery bags just like the kids running errands in their villages. Fuck the Asian liquor stores and groceries, all looking insecure, only kissing white people's asses. Fuck the Under Armour crowd, young white Western barbarians and their pet friends, competing with each other, afraid of black people and Latinos. Fuck damn Latinos. The women pushing cleaning supplies up the buildings to clean some apartment of a lazy-ass being. Fuck the Latino men, washing dishes like sluts, drinking their Coronas, and snorting the worst cocaine ever. Fuck those Wall Street boys and their fucking Teslas. They can't even change a tire if they go flat. Wanna look like DiCaprio, but get fucked up by some kid in Idaho buying GameSpot shares through his Cash App account? Fuck the Hell's Kitchen crowd, walking around with their rainbow gadgets, showing out their dirt. Animals loving in a sexual mode, like beasts. Fuck 12, fuck the police, losers in uniform, racist as fuck, killing black men for no reason and storming on the Capitol Hill with Trump flags. Fuck them black motherfuckers. Learned and trained by the white men to wear gold and expensive sneakers. No matter how fat and nasty a Karen is, they always turn to check their ass. Fuck those Antifas, trust fund kids, playing to be alternative. Fuck the white girls always on the phone gossiping, pulling their rescue dogs with missing legs and head cones. They think they're helping humanity. Fuck the Irish and the Italians. Fuck their Felas and their four-leaf clovers. Fuck the Yankees, worst sport ever, boring and fixed. Fuck 9/11 and fuck them all. Fuck the Hasids and their hair, the clothes dirty from matzo balls running down their black garbadines. Fuck the ghetto and the diamonds. Fuck the priests and the blind men, rubbing down their dicks on the children. Fuck JC, he got it easy. Fuck this state, this nation, this continent, and the entire world. Let COVID mutate and kill every single soul on this earth. Her got out of the metro on a dark afternoon of a rainy day, walked slowly to the row house, opened the door, and went in. Joel and David were sitting down at the dining table, old and dried. They were impressed and recognized her instantly. They were mute. They could not speak a word. Her, with anger in his face, sat down at the table where Jersey used to sit. He pulled out the pack of letters that his mother wrote and were never delivered to him, pulled out a lighter, and started burning the letters on top of the table. David laughed nervously and called him Meshuggah. Her jumped on top of the table, choked David, and pinned him to the ground. He put his hand inside David's jacket and pulled out a small red velvet bag. He opened it and put its contents in his mouth, then forcibly opened David's mouth and started spitting back the diamonds into David's mouth. He turned and looked at Joel straight in his eyes. Joel was frozen. Her went with the single hand to Joel's neck. He pulled him out of the chair and slammed him into the wall. Joel started crying, saying sorry. He kneeled in front of her. Her unzipped his pants, pulled his penis out, and started peeing on his father's bald head. When he was finished, he zipped up his pants, walked out the door, leaving the door wide open. He vanished in the rain while the old men shouted, "Unholy." The end.